Wonderful. Okay, thank you. I feel like we're at a eulogy. You know, U.S. policy to Central Asia was a good man. And I suppose there is a bit of that vertically challenged, that's better. I suppose there is a bit of that when we discuss the U.S., and I'm sort of thinking of it as we looked at the day's dynamics, where we began with, I thought, you know, the potential, the future. You know, we were looking forward to what may happen with Chinese engagement in the region, because in many ways, China's still on that cusp of, lots of opportunities, let's see what happens. Maybe there have been a few setbacks, some concerns raised, but let's wait and see. The U.S., like it or not, we've had a track record. I do remember the 1990s and the optimism, and in fact was on a campaign reform AID project in Russia in the 1990s, because we were convinced the Russians really wanted to be like us when it came to electing their officials. Maybe given this election, we're like them, but it was sort of this optimism that came forth, and I think what we're seeing now is maybe a bit of a reality check. And so it's not necessarily pessimism, but more of a deep sigh. Okay, what's happened for 20 years plus, and where do we go from here? Because we are that big question, and this gets back to some of the points Eric raised, and I think these reports of Central Asia 3.0 and all that we can look into. Now, I'm going to take a specific slice of this, which is really more the security realm, and hopefully complement what's been said already on this panel. And I should note that in this wordy title, I say post-ISAF, and it's the same remark about post-Soviet. I share this about post-ISAF, but do we call it the Resolute Support World? We still don't know what that is. I mean, it's a mission in progress. I work with Resolute Support a couple times a year, and they're still drafting the playbook. What's it going to look like? I mean, reality check, that was the same with ISAF throughout its history. There was never a single ISAF agenda. It kept changing year after year, depending on which country. So, for sake of narrative, we'll say post-ISAF. And of course, what that suggests is we're looking at a realm that is maybe a bit Afghan-centric, or Afghanistan is a key actor, and I think when we look at U.S. engagement with Central Asia, we do at the end of the day have to figure out, how does this Afghan connection affect us? Do we see a commitment to engage in the region? Are we still linked with this 2.0 realm of security-focused Afghan centrism with respect to our relationship with the Central Asian states, plural, or is it something else? Well, in the something else, we may want to take all the things we've done in the past, put them in a bag, mix it, and throw it out, like a good game of Yahtzee, where the dice are on the floor, and much like, I know that and we've seen these in presentations around town over the last year or so, well, what are our interests? How are we managing? And again, as I look at it, in no particular order, but I'll look at it from a practical side first, operational side, is we are looking at this transition from operations in Afghanistan, where we had a robust base structure at Manas. We discussed, yes, Northern Distribution Network to feed into the system. Yes, we have the new Silk Road Initiative, or whatever Silk Road mantra you want to use. We throw all of this together, and that was the recipe for success, right? We were going to have all these things linked together, and in post-2014, it'll work. Well, we have some other issues at play as well, and some have already noted that these. We have and continue to have emphasis on border security, counterterrorism activity. In fact, this goes farther than some of these other engagements. Energy sector development. It's been in fits and starts. This started in the mid-90s, continues today, although under different conditions. The enthusiasm for the Trans-Caspian pipeline in the mid-1990s, or even the CENTGAS project, compare those to the rather muted commentary on TAPI, at least from the U.S. side, and we can see that maybe energy isn't as important. And I couldn't agree more with Eric's comments on the notion of democratization, human rights, even humanitarian assistance. These were the hallmarks of some of the initial engagements in the region. They're still there. They haven't gone away. It's just that they've been overshadowed often by the security element. The question is, how do we use these, or how do we engage with these ahead? Well, the challenges we have, and I say we, the security folks, and I'll note here that as, coming from the Defense Department, these are my views and not that of the U.S. Department of Defense or the National Defense University or the Near East South Asia Center or my parents. Slava Bogu. We have a couple of structural challenges. We have some real structural challenges, and this is one of them. It's even how we orient ourselves to the region. This is key. Last December, I was speaking at a conference in Doha. It was a CENTCOM Commanders Conference for all the ambassadors from the region, and of course they all descend on Doha, and we're talking about the issues of the day: Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc. The 5 ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors to Central Asia were there. We really didn't spend much time at all talking about their world. We talked about the rest of CENTCOM, and you can imagine 2015 why that would be the case. ISIS is our problem number 1, correct? And so if we can connect Central Asia to that threat, fantastic. If we want to talk about something else, that's page 7. It's back burner stuff. This was an issue, by the way, that helped Central Asia in the last decade, because everything was about Afghanistan. So try being the ambassador to Jordan when everyone's talking about Afghanistan. So you can see that things have been reversed a bit. It's about U.S. troops. It's a numbers game too. It's funny when I teach, and I'll sort of talk about the Afghan campaign and these are even graduate students who should know kind of the sequence of the campaign, but you say, how many troops did we have at the beginning? Oh, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 troops as early as 2001. Well, it was about 500 plus, and then it went up to a couple thousand. And you can see that for most of the campaign, it was a pretty small U.S. commitment, small in relative terms, and it wasn't really until 9 and 10 that we shot up to over 100,000, and the entire ISAF commitment up to 152,000. But we imagine that now as how we must be in Afghanistan, like this robust capacity. So we're going to have to work in the region. Well, guess what? We're down to about 15,000 if you consider the U.S. plus NATO allies and other allies in the region. So even the need for Central Asia, the need for the other countries in the area isn't as important. And in fact, it's really more about the drawdown, isn't it? It's about getting us out. It's the logistics issue. The transportation folks are much more critical today than the good geopolitical discussants. So how do we use trade routes? How do we use bases other than Manas? These are the important questions of the day, and quite frankly, what we're finding is we don't really need a lot because there's simply not much to support. What we're seeing now in the post-ISAF world is a campaign run by Afghans, managed by Afghans. This is an Afghan military, Afghan security force effort, good or bad, and there's a lot of problems there. But we play now a support role as opposed to the one we played in the last decade. That fundamentally shifts our logistical footprint. It also shifts our commitment to the region. Now, I will say on a positive note, we do have things like bilateral security agreements. Sometimes these are very, very difficult processes. Status of forces agreements, boy, wouldn't it be nice to get these throughout the region in all countries? Well, we have them in some way, shape, or form, but the notion that we have individual agreements, that is, the U.S. does with Central Asian states and obviously Afghanistan itself. But what does this mean for long-term security implications? Sometimes it just boils down to stuff. Excess defense articles. Well, that process is about over, right? We're getting the things out of Afghanistan. It's not like the good old days when the U.S. had a huge budget and we could just bury equipment in the sand because it was too cumbersome to take it out. Now we actually worry about taking it out. But our continued presence and assistance in the region, this is key. And of course, no surprise, it's going down. Now, that was the reality. We also have the myth, and this is where we see things blur. For example, the transit center, a pretty boring tale. We needed a base facility. Base facility is open for us. We use it full capacity, a pretty robust operation, always a temporary operation. It was always a temporary operation. And when the Kyrgyz government told us to leave, which I was actually surprised, that's about 6 years after I thought we were going to have to leave. I thought, we held on longer than expected, and the Kyrgyz government had us help hold on as long as expected. But when we were told to leave, we left. It's been spun into a variety of stories and interesting tales, I would say, about what was our purpose there. Was this part of a series of over 500 bases? according to some Russian publications, that we had throughout the region to begin this encirclement campaign of Russia. I've also heard encirclement of other countries, depends which country you want to encircle, I guess. But was Manas going to be used for other reasons? Was it going to be this permanent, the argument made, we heard this morning, possible launching pad for a campaign against Iran? Absolutely, this is brought up. In the mythology realm, in the practical world, I'm going to defer to people who have knowledge of that. I don't. But at the end of the day, it closed. And it closed like other bases throughout the world have. That is where the U.S. owned them, and then we gave them back, whether it's the Philippines, France, you name it. Of course, now this has been brought into the mythology realm. It's been brought into part of a great game competition. We could even say a war of the bases. I love these analyses that have, here's our bases, here's their bases, here's how we're playing geopolitics in the region. Guess what? There is no war. There's no U.S. base. There's no U.S. presence in terms of full-blown active military presence. And even as noted in the last session, the Russian presence is a bit muted. It's not as extreme as I think people thought it would be, even though there are discussions of these rapid forces, action forces. The reality is they'll probably keep it to a minimum as well, which if I were in Central Asia, this could be a concern, depending on which direction we go. And just the last point to note here in terms of our presence, it's also a numbers game. And these, you'll see the dates on these are going to vary. Part I was looking for good charts that could explain these. And we see some pretty modest numbers here. Now we see this, in fact, this is development assistance, but these actually parallel some of the security assistance numbers, and no surprise, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan do well, but if we compare these to Pakistan and Afghanistan, they don't do so well. I'm going to give credit where credit is due. This is a former student of mine, Amanda Ogden, who did this. I could never do a slide like that, so I'm just going to say it's her slide, which is why I have the note there. And but it shows that we've always kept it in modest proportions compared to some of the neighboring states. To be honest, Central Asia has been critical to an extent. So hyperbole aside, we have to figure out now what's next. And sometimes it's really about meetings and exercises. Sometimes it's about maintaining contact. It's about engaging with officials, not just at the senior level, but at the working level. It's about conducting exercises so we understand each other. But at the end of the day, are we really looking at interoperability between Central Asian militaries and the U.S. military? Probably not. Probably because the common threats and challenges aren't really there. Maybe. Because this is the point that I'll finish with, which is Afghanistan. Afghanistan 2016 and beyond. Now, this is the conundrum that we collectively face, and this is the issue that I would say might make us rethink engagement in Central Asia, but itself offers a logic problem. That is, we're leaving. I think as was noted before, departures, the December 2011, we are leaving Afghanistan, but it is still a strategic, important country. We're still trying to square this. The current levels of support. We need over $4 billion a year to support their security forces. Can we sustain that? And it depends on which president takes over in 2017, and I don't care from which party. But that's a challenge they're going to have to face, and I suspect the lack of U.S. troops, the lack of U.S. security interests in Afghanistan will mean a lack of assistance in that country. The connection and disconnection question has been discussed ad nauseum, which is great, because that really is a core aspect here. Is Afghanistan part of this broader connected region? And ultimately, when we look at the long-term challenges, what are the things on the horizon we need to worry about? I would say it still is, first and foremost, a security issue. It's the economic development. I'm going to throw in the demographic issue. Now, it's not this demographic issue. I always love when people say, oh, Afghanistan's going to fracture along ethnic lines. I think it's more this issue. It's more the generational question. Because they have a problem. It is a country that has hey, good news for less violence, believe it or not, for the younger generation, better health care, longer lifespans, and so now we're going to see millions of Afghans entering the job market every year, needing employment, needing to keep this economy going at a good rate. They need to have an 8 to 10% growth rate a year in order to sustain and, in fact, move beyond subsistence. This is a challenge. If I'm a neighbor, if I'm in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, even Pakistan, which I have my own problems like this, I worry about these issues. And yes, even Iran. Isn't it nice? We can say Iran now. Almost. And so what we have here are some futures. And each of these, I'll just go through them very quickly because I want to leave time for questions and discussion. And I have a timekeeper who's, is that?
That's a 5.
Awesome, good, okay. At first I thought that was a 3, my vision's bad, so 5 is better. But I've just killed 20 seconds saying that. So we have potential futures for Afghanistan, and it's pretty simple. It's from the good news, stability, limited internal conflict, ungoverned spaces that really focus on traffickers dealing with these, our Colombia case, ungoverned spaces dealing with terrorists. We've seen these, and then complete state collapse and anarchy. The sad thing is Afghanistan has experienced all of these in some way, shape, or form. And yes, these issues could exist at, how should I say, in different places of the country. But just to give a quick example of these, and I'll just give 1 or 2 of these and then we'll close. But give the scenario, what if Afghanistan is a stable country? No. Everyone's like, wait a second, you're crazy. I'm a Cubs fan. I can be optimistic. And what does stability look like? It looks like economic integration. It looks like the programs that were raised earlier today, in fact, in this session. How do we connect Afghanistan to its neighbors? It has a dominant military. If you think about it, security forces of over 200,000 strong, that's a big force. They may not be the best trained or the best armed, although now with new AK-47s, that's a good thing, maybe. But do they compete with the Pakistani military or the Iranian military? Do they look northward? If I were Central Asian, I wouldn't see this as a threat. But what I do see is an Afghanistan that is going to continue international engagement, become part of assistance programs with the U.S., with NATO. You could see the SCO. You could see it in this web of, if you want to say, interlocking security architecture. Very good European phrase, and it's very important for Afghanistan. The security options for Central Asia may, in fact, include engagement. I say may, because the Amu Darya is a very wide river, and somehow the views north-south don't tend to really correspond. But what this means is, in some ways, a situation where you're going to manage integration. But I'll take this one as a second example. Limited internal conflict, which is really, I hate to say, the best case scenario. That is, you're going to see a country that will struggle with, do we call it perpetual civil war, or do we call it challenges within? Well, it becomes a modest threat to its neighbors, and what this does do is it requires increased attention from outside powers, particularly those that can bring it in, and that would unfortunately be the West, the U.S. in particular. And joining international security structures is soon going to be off the table. If I were a Central Asian leader, security official, I would now position my forces south. I would now start to look at this really as my biggest external existential concern. And then what we'll do is go to the final one. These slides are available, Marlene will have them, is state collapse and anarchy. Because this is the one that people talk about. You know, this is the return to 92. This is the we told you so moment. This is Yemen and Somalia and all that. Were this to happen, and I actually don't mean to make light of it, were this to happen, what we're looking at is a governance and economic void, now in the middle of Central Asia, right in the middle of this wonderful Obor Silk Road route. There's no development in the country, state legitimacy disappears, the security situation, quite frankly, becomes opportunistic, and this is where it gets a bit scary. People may find certain allies they want to support and play with. We've seen that before. We saw that in the 80s. We saw that in the 90s. We saw that in the last decade. The security options for Central Asia, the Trumpian wall looks good. You want to shut Afghanistan off. You want to cut this south-north connection apart for the sake of internal stability and security. This becomes a problem, and quite frankly, all these discussions of regional cooperation go by the wayside. So in the end, is Afghanistan a partner or a threat? Ooh, that's a perception. One would love to see it the former. The question is, how do you get people to think that? Because the overriding view in the region, and quite frankly, the overriding view in this country, the city, is that it's more of a threat. It's a challenge. The economic concerns and security concerns are problematic. Can we help bridge it? this was really the purpose of discussions like this. This is the purpose of so many meetings in town. But ultimately, it's about shared national security interests. We sometimes have a disconnect here, and the connectivity issue going back to session 1. Because are we willing to create conditions for regional development? Are we able to actually commit resources? And I still find in this current period, in this 3.0 if we want to call it, we're having a tough time doing that. And so last 10 seconds, 20 seconds to sum up, yes, lots of things to say here. How do we as an external actor view Central Asia, view Afghanistan? For those who watch us, who observe, look at the statements and speeches and agreements and visits, that's all fine. Ignore things like great games, and this year in particular, pay attention to the think tank and policy briefs, because everyone's advertising for a job for the next administration. So you're seeing these come out in droves, which they're actually kind of interesting. But the reality are the capabilities. What's our budget? What are we actually putting to it? How do we staff it? And what are our limitations? And the same, by the way, can apply to the Russians, Chinese, and others. So with that, we're done. Okay. Thank you.